Well, it's Christ the King Sunday. And as Pastor Alyssa said, it's also known as Reign of Christ Sunday. And I was going to make a joke about Snow of Christ Sunday, but luckily that didn't happen. So when we talk about the reign of Christ, we aren't talking about rain that comes from the sky. We're talking about the reign of a monarch. The reign of a monarch over their kingdom. It's an old-fashioned term to us Americans. Since we kicked the British out of here in 1776, we haven't been ruled by a monarch since then. So we're not really used to this kind of kingly language. But in the church year, throughout the year, as we follow the church calendar, or the liturgical calendar, if we want to use the fancy term, Christ the King Sunday is the last Sunday in the church year. Next Sunday is the first Sunday of Advent, the first Sunday of the church year. Advent is the season during which we anticipate the birth of the baby Jesus. Today we celebrate Jesus as King. And next Sunday we begin to think about the coming of Jesus as a helpless infant. Moving through the lectionary readings every year, we encounter Jesus at different stages of his life and ministry. From his birth as a baby through his growing up years, his baptism, his 3 years of active ministry, and then his trial, crucifixion, his death, and resurrection. Today, our reading describes a day in Jesus' life. Well, actually not just any day. It's actually his last day. In this section of John's Gospel, we witness a portion of the proceedings that we often refer to as the Passion of Christ. After Jesus' arrest in the Garden of Gethsemane, he was put through a series of trials, both literally and figuratively. Jesus was tried before the court of the Jewish leadership, called the Sanhedrin, and then marched across Jerusalem to the palace of the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate. This is where this conversation happens, in the palace of the Roman leader of the whole region of Judea, the most powerful man in the area. So there's many possible messages within this text, but you have to, as a pastor, choose just one. And on this Christ the King Sunday, I want us to focus on these two men in the story, on how they lead, on their position as leaders. So what kind of leader is Pilate? What can we learn about him from the story? Pilate waffles. Pilate changes his mind a lot. The Jewish leaders have brought Jesus to Pilate, and they've told Pilate, you should order his death. And Pilate just can't decide what to do. This small text we have today, these 4 verses, sit in a much larger passage. If you read the whole passage, you see that Pilate actually changes his mind almost 7 times. 7 different times he goes outside the palace to where the Jewish leadership are standing in the courtyard. And then he goes back inside and has a conversation with Jesus. And then he goes back outside to the Jewish leadership and he tries one more time to get out of having to make this decision. And then he goes back inside to ask Jesus these questions. Pilate waffles. He tries to get out of making a decision by arguing that it's not up to him. This isn't my decision. He's a Jew. I'm not a Jew. You people decide. You're the Jewish leaders. You take care of this. Why did you bring him to me? And yet, he's the most powerful man in the whole territory. Pilate even admits more than once in this story that Jesus has done nothing wrong. He asks Jesus in our text, what have you done? Pilate knows of no crime that Jesus has committed. A couple of times he goes back out to the Jewish leadership and he says, I see no wrong in this man. So why didn't Pilate set him free? The most powerful man in the country, presented with an innocent man, the judge who could decide this man's fate, and he doesn't do it. He waffles. Pilate is acting out of fear. Later in this story, just a few passages later, we're told that he gives in to the crowd when the crowd threatens to tell Caesar that Pilate is worshiping another king and is, quote, no friend of the emperor. And bowing to this threat on his powerful position, that possibly Caesar would take his job away from him, demote him, maybe send him back out into the desert, he waffles and he gives in. He turns Jesus over to the Jewish leadership and says, do with him what you want. Knowing Jesus is innocent, he hands him over. Eventually, at the end of the story, there's this famous scene where Pilate washes his hands. Literally, he takes water and he washes his hands and he says, I bear no responsibility in this. But simply washing his hands doesn't remove the responsibility from him. So what kind of leader is Jesus? What do we see just in this conversation, just in this story? What do we see of Jesus' leadership style? Jesus takes charge of this conversation. He isn't passive or cowed by Pilate. He doesn't just act in fear and answer Pilate's question and give in. No, he knows exactly who he is, and his message is the same throughout the conversation. The message that he gives Pilate over and over is, you don't know who I am. Jesus remains focused on his mission. His purpose, his whole life, is to show us truth. And Jesus remembers who he is. Later in this, just after this section, Pilate will send Jesus to be beaten and then bring him back in and have some more questioning. After the beating, after Jesus has been flogged and made fun of, and Pilate threatens to kill him, Pilate says to him, you realize I have the power of life and death over you. And Jesus' response is, you would have no power over me unless it had been given you from above. Jesus knows exactly who he is, he knows what his mission is, and he never wavers. So now I want to step off from our story quite drastically, and I want to talk to you about knights. Medieval knights. K-N-I-G-H-T. Not the knights that come at the end of the day, but the knights of old, medieval knights in particular. Before these young men and women, I checked that out, there were female knights. Before they're knights, they serve as vassals or servants in a household of a lord or a monarch. Knighthood is the final step in a system designed to prepare them for service to the king. The name of the ceremony to confer knighthood is called the accolade. The accolade is the act of tapping the blade of the sword on the shoulders of the one who comes to be knighted. It's also known as dubbing, as in, I dub thee, Sir Knight. It was the central act of the ceremony conferring knighthood in the Middle Ages. Now we use the term accolade to mean praise or award or honor, as our first song showed us. The term accolade comes from a Latin root, two words, ad meaning to, and collum meaning neck. Accolade therefore means to the neck. And in the original language, it can mean embrace. Instead of using the sword, sometimes the ritual could have been an embrace or a blow to the face or the neck. The blow, when first utilized, was given with a fist, was a box to the ear. This was later substituted by a gentle stroke with the flat part of the blade of the sword, and then developed into the custom of tapping on either the right or left shoulder or both, which is still the tradition in the United Kingdom today. So I'd like to demonstrate this ceremony for you because I never really understood it until I saw it in action. So I've asked Floyd Cloak to come up, and Floyd will be our volunteer knight for a day. There was no chance Floyd and I were going to get through this without humor. The knight comes to the monarch, and the first thing he does, aside from just approaching the throne, which was dangerous in and of itself, because if you approached the throne and the king was not happy with you, your life was in danger just by coming to him. And then he would hand over his sword. The king would take the sword of the knight and draw it and place it first on the right shoulder and then gently up just barely over the top of the head and down onto the left shoulder. And then sheath the sword. Correctly. Hand it back to the knight, who rises and is given the title Sir and is excused to live in service to his king. Thank you, Floyd. Sir Floyd. So during, I know, right? The Lord works in mysterious ways as wonders do perform. So during the ceremony, the knight would make several oaths or vows. He would swear on his life that he would do several things. 3 of them are these. He would swear that he would be loyal to his Lord, his only king from now on, serving him and him alone. The knight would also vow an oath to be brave. The knight didn't know what he would be called on to do, whether it be just carrying a message on horseback from his kingdom to another, or possibly acting as a diplomat in negotiations with a foreign ruler, or be asked to go into battle. The knight didn't know, but he vows to be brave. And he vows that he will never avoid a dangerous path out of fear. Trusting his king to know what is best, the knight won't let fear rule him. He'll allow his king to rule him. He knows his king, he trusts his king, and he trusts him with his life. So when the knight hands over his sword, he is quite literally handing over his own weapon, and he's giving his king the opportunity to kill him with his own weapon. The sword is also the knight's job. It's his skill. It's his tool of trade. It's the thing that he makes money with sometimes. Giving the king, in essence, his everything, his very life. And then he kneels before the king, figuratively making himself smaller than the king, giving honor to the king, and physically displaying his understanding that he is under the king's authority. And then the knight bows his head. Now we think of bowing the head in prayer, but ever since I first learned about the knighting ceremony, it's given me a whole new look on bowing in prayer. The knight bows his head, exposing his neck, the most vulnerable part of our physical bodies. He exposes his neck to his king, who is holding his sword. And the act of placing the sword first on one shoulder and then raising it up and over the head and down onto the other shoulder is a representation of the fact that the king could take this sword and go through instead of over. That is why they place the sword on both shoulders. It literally enacts the cutting off of the knight's head. He is saying, here's my sword, here's my life, here's my head, do with it what you want. The point of this whole thing isn't that the knight is fearful. It's that he trusts. He trusts this king. As the girls told us, they looked at these 3 kings and they said, what about these kings draws me? What about these kings do I honor? Is it the love coming from the eyes of the one, the softness, the compassion? Is it the fierceness of the middle one, the intelligence that radiates from his face? What is it that draws us to a king? The knight comes and says, you're the one I pick, and I give you everything I've got. Do with me whatever you will. So now I'd like to take us back to the palace. Ironically, it was in a palace that this scene takes place. Jesus, who left his kingly palace, his heavenly palace, his throne, and came as a baby, as we anticipate in Advent, came as a baby, gave up all of that power, and came to earth. It was in a palace that this scene happens. It has been a long night. It's actually early in the morning, as the story tells us. So what's happened the night before? The night before was the Last Supper. The night before was Passover, when Jesus celebrated the Last Supper with his disciples. He's been up all night because after that supper was when he took his disciples and he went into the garden to pray. Remember that story? He takes his disciples and he goes into the garden to pray. And what does he pray when he's there? He says, "Lord, not my will, but thine be done." He prays to his Father in heaven one more time, giving his life over to the will of his Father. Jesus was a servant. Jesus knew who he was, and he knew what he came to earth to do. But he was a humble king. A king who knew his power, his mission. He didn't succumb to the humanly fear, but bravely faced all that was required of him. He gave his life, his whole life, in service to his Father's will. Jesus is the kind of king that we can trust because he has lived our human existence and he knows our struggles. Jesus empathizes with us in our struggles, unlike Pilate, who dismissively says about the people he was supposed to protect, "I'm not a Jew, am I? Those are your people." No, Jesus knows our struggles, and he knows who he came to care for and protect. His whole life was devoted to healing and actively loving everyone he met. Jesus' life teaches us how to serve. We can come to Jesus on our knees and give our lives in service to his kingdom, trusting that he will be a kind and compassionate king, because he has been where we are. He has been on his knees. One of the ironies of this story is that the knighting ceremony, the vassal who comes to be knighted, who gives his life to the king, this was also Jesus, who came on his knees to his Father and gave his life in service, willingly, trusting. Jesus is not just the king to whom we bow. He has been the one on his knees too. We can trust him to be our Savior, our Christ, our King, because he is a servant king. I'm going to pause right now and do something I rarely do, and that's to say, if you have never actually made that decision to take Christ as your king, to make that personal commitment, not just to the story that you've heard, but to the person of Jesus Christ and his life and ministry, I'd like you to think about doing that today. Let me close this in prayer. If you bow with me, please. Most gracious God, who in the person of Jesus of Nazareth showed us an alternative to the kings and queens and emperors of history, help us to revere and emulate Jesus' leadership, to love and seek justice for all people. Help us to recognize the true grandeur and life-changing power that is based in loving you and all of our neighbors. God, we ask that you give us the power of the Holy Spirit to help us co-create a kingdom here, ruled not through dominion, but in the radical and all-powerful, compassionate love of Christ. Amen. Our